Romans had complete power over the lives of their slaves. Slaves could be punished for the smallest mistake, and there was nothing they could do about it. Many slaves lived lives of fear and misery. In some parts of the world today, little has changed. Modern slaves are also forced to work long hours, sometimes as many as 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. And these young people know if they don't work hard, they'll also be punished. Many lead miserable lives without hope. These modern slaves work for organisations who make money out of their labour illegally. Unlike the system of slavery in Pompeii, where slaves' loss of freedom was completely legal.
Under Roman law, masters had absolute power over their slaves. They could kill their slaves, they could beat their slaves, they could torture their slaves, they could do absolutely anything at all, and the slave would have no recourse. There would be nothing against this by law. And masters could and did do this to slaves who had offended them, a slave who committed a major crime would certainly be executed, and crucifixion would be the normal punishment that would be applied to a slave. So certainly there was a great deal of brutality. Slaves performed all sorts of functions in Roman society, and how they were treated would often depend on those functions. The worst sort of slave to be, in all likelihood, would be to be in the mines. You would not live very long if you were a slave in the mines. But they would also be agricultural slaves who would have a slightly better life, but still a life of a great deal of hardship and, in all likelihood, a great deal of brutality, although there were certain people, like the elder Pliny, who argued that it was not in the master's interests, apart from any question of humanity, to treat their slaves, their agricultural slaves, badly.
This picture of a master beating his slave shows how violent life was for many slaves who lived and worked in Pompeii. A famous doctor of the time, Galen, noted how many slave owners actually injured themselves hitting their slaves.
The slave society was cruel, and it wasn't cruel at the same time. It was cruel in the sense that people had this power and that they frequently were able to exercise that power. It was also not cruel because also very frequently people who theoretically had power didn't choose to exercise it. So you did find masters who would treat their slaves with a great deal of humanity.
But some masters not only treated their slaves with kindness and respect, but even gave them their freedom.
There were several ways that slaves could become free, but there was one official way that gave you official freedom, which was that your master would take you before a Roman official who was called a praetor.
Freeing a slave in front of the praetor was a simple procedure. The slave kneels before his master, showing that he is still a slave. The white felt hat indicates that he is now free after he has been touched on the shoulder with a rod. This finally breaks the invisible chain that binds the slave to the master. A final handshake welcomes the freed man to a new world where he will be able to do what he wants.
That process is called manumission, from the Latin words manus, meaning a hand, and mitto, to send, sending out from under the hand.
Freeing a slave could be as simple and informal as beckoning him to join you on the couch, in front of friends as witnesses, although the slave would very often have paid to be a freed man.
You simply couldn't tell, for the most part, how many slaves there were. And a fair number of people around you might be slaves, or they might be free, and you'll be mingling with them in the street, and very often you couldn't tell. The best estimate that we have is that at most 20% of the population of Italy was slaves. That was about the highest it got.
The figure may be even higher, but for many visitors to Pompeii, recognising who was the master and who was the slave remained a mystery.